and PhD, and you specialize in U.S. history. So you got to tell us how he ended up in Ohio from Washington, D.C.?
Still trying to figure it out myself.
Hey, gentlemen, real quickly, I have been instructed to make a few announcements before we launch into this to just make sure everybody's on the same page, and I want to make sure it runs smoothly, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. First of all, I am recording this meeting. My name is Susan Timmer. I'm the new HASP program coordinator. Kim won't be with us today, so when you see HASP virtual class, whether my picture is there or not, you can always go to the bottom of your screen and send me a chat if you have a question. The reminders are, please keep your mute on. When you come into the classroom, you're muted. But once you come in, please stay muted unless you're talking. Dr. Johnson has indicated that he's going to take questions at the end and leave ample time for that. At 11 o'clock, I will close the class and invite people that need to leave at 11 to leave. And if you want to stay, Dr. Johnson's been kind enough to say that he would take questions if they're still lingering. There's 3 buttons at the bottom of your screen that, if you haven't attended a Zoom call, are very important to know about. If you hover at the bottom of your screen, whether you're on an iPad, I believe it's the same as on an iPad as a computer screen, but you'll see 2 important buttons on the left-hand side. There is a microphone that says mute, and if you click that, you'll see a line go through it, and that means you're muted. And then there's also stop video. And Kim has asked me to share with everybody that if you're doing something that's distracting, or if you have a lot of activity behind you, or you're just going to be listening, to just go ahead and turn your video off and we'll just see your name. I believe that that is all my reminders that I'm supposed to tell you. So please proceed. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Sure. Okay, you want me to introduce Dr. Johnson? Is that where we're at?
Yes, go ahead, Gary. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Johnson's a professor of history at Hope College. He went to, got his college degree at Bowie State outside of Washington, D.C., and then moved to Ohio, to Kent State, where he got his master's and PhD. He is a professor of history at Hope College. He specializes in American history. And he's basically a HASP groupie for all of us because he's our favorite history professor and he's an experienced Zoom leader. So with that, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. And HASP was my favorite group to present to also. Good morning, everybody. I have missed being in front of you. I have missed seeing you all. And like Susan said, I'm looking forward to the chance that we can be back together. We're continuing on the next 3 weeks with the series we were doing before we had the break, which was under the heading of Last Stand. So let's just get right to it, shall we? And this one, the subtitle is Last Stand's Final Warning of Ike and Smedley. That would be General Smedley B. Butler, United States Marine Corps, who was a 2-time Medal of Honor winner. He fought in the early 20th century. Ironically enough, they called him the Fighting Quaker. Quakers have a reputation for being, I don't know if they're pacifists, but definitely anti-war. But Smedley Butler was a different kind of Quaker. He joined the Marine Corps at a young age and fought in Central America. He fought in what they called the Banana Wars, a lot of incursions into Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala in the early part of the 20th century, as I mentioned. And the other person we're talking about is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who went on to become the 34th President of the United States. Now, both of these men have something in common. In addition to being Americans, in addition to being extremely motivated, highly intelligent, they both had given the greater part of their adult lives to the profession of arms. Dwight Eisenhower from Abilene, Kansas, was a graduate of West Point. He was with General MacArthur in the 1930s when the veterans of World War I marched on Washington during what was called the Bonus Marchers strike, on World War I veterans who have been promised a bonus for enlisting to fight in from 1917 to 1918 when that war ended. They wanted their money right now because, of course, during the Great Depression, people were desperate. And these veterans said, listen, we want the government to pay us our money right now. The response to that was where the government, the president, ordered General MacArthur, also future General Patton, and Eisenhower to disperse these veterans in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, General Eisenhower would go on to become the person that was known as the planner or the Supreme Commander of SHAEF, S-H-A-E-F, Supreme Headquarters Allied European Forces. He's generally identified as being the coordinator, the politician, the strategist, the ones that pretty much made the D-Day landing at Normandy be a success. So clearly a very talented man. And as I mentioned, just like with General Butler, that both of these guys had given their lives to the profession of arms. And they say that war is both a science and an art. It's scientific because it involves especially modern warfare, involves all of the elements of modern science, modern economy, modern politics, modern culture. But it's an art because there's a certain type of, it's a certain type of artistry that goes along to making sure that an attack plan fulfills the strategy of vision of a commander. All the pieces have to work at the right time. All the coordinating functions have to hit more accurately than not, or else people die. Things go wrong, defeat, surrender is a possibility. So both of these guys were very good at what they did. And you see in this picture on the right with General Eisenhower, this is a picture of him giving some final words of encouragement to paratroopers on the morning of D-Day, June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the invasion and liberation of Europe. Another thing that both General Butler and General Eisenhower had in common was that toward the end of their careers, in General Eisenhower's case, the end of his presidency, and in General Butler's case, after he had gotten out of the Marine Corps, they both had a revelation about the profession that they had given their lives to. They both had an understanding, or they both noticed something that had changed from the time that they had joined the military to the time that they either got out of the military, or in President Eisenhower's case, as he was retiring from the presidency in 1960, he gave a final warning. I suspect that a number of you are aware what that is, but it's interesting how General Butler in the 1930s and then General Eisenhower 30 years later were basically giving a warning for the same thing, and we will come to that. To better understand the warning that General Eisenhower and General Butler were giving, I want to take us not so much into history, but to have us look at a contemporaneous situation which speaks to the warning that they were giving. Now, the last few weeks that things have been happening during the summer have been so much on issues of race, class, politics. We need to also keep our mind on other things that are challenging America's Democratic Republic right now. And a lot of it has to do with regard to General Butler and General Eisenhower's warning, with regard to their warning about what's happening here in Washington, D.C., particularly in the Congress, and more specifically, in the chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Because the thing that General Butler and General Eisenhower warned against has in many ways come to pass. They're worried about, of course, Congress is where the appropriations for the nation is supposed to take place. It's a very murky area. It is very complex. And in this particular case, we're gonna limit our discussion this morning to the Department of Defense. And particularly when it comes to procurement. In other words, how we go about procuring some of the products, some of the projects, some of the weapons that Americans are being given, that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guards men and women are being given to use to defend the United States. So where to begin? Let's start here. DARPA stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. This is a fascinating organization. They don't actually produce weapons, but what they do is they engage in a lot of research and administration. They are the cutting edge of the cutting edge of the sharpest part of the cutting edge of weapons development, weapons envisioning, weapons testing. You know, this is where you might find the stuff that looks like it's space age or it seems like it's science fiction. But in many cases, what, as they say in Hollywood, science fiction is more and more becoming science fact. When you look at some of the weapons that DARPA has been producing, some of the things that they've been researching, you can very quickly get the idea there's a bunch of mad scientists in there just having unlimited resources to produce whatever comes to mind. Well, I don't know if they're mad or not, but they do have some unlimited resources, or at least some very, very expansive resources to produce items like this. This is called a robotic pack animal. Now, this is from the publication Business Insider. The Marine Corps and the Army, but I'll speak specifically for the Marine Corps, because I know that the Marine Corps has been testing these things out. These robotic pack animals are being used. But let's think early 20th century, World War I. In World War I, mules and horses were used to carry extra equipment that human soldiers did not want to carry or would be too heavy for them. So think about the horse and mule of World War I that now is a robotic mule to carry extra equipment. These things have been tested and they're being deployed to the field. This particular weapon, a self-calculating gun scope. Now, the intent here is that snipers would use this. A lot of times when snipers are on a mission, they have to account for things like wind, range, elevation, terrain, a whole range of things to zero in on their target. This particular instrument, the self-calculating gun scope, would take a lot of the guesswork, if not all the guesswork, out of what a sniper has to do. This concept, a solar-powered drone that can stay airborne for years. DARPA is also looking into producing a system that gives soldiers enhanced optical awareness. In other words, a contact lens that basically will provide a filter or a screen right on the eye that will give a soldier what they call an HUD, heads-up display for acquiring a target, zeroing in on a target, checking ranges, a whole menu of things that would make the soldier more efficient, so we hope, in accomplishing their mission. A precise lightweight laser weapon. And again, these things are not being just thought up on a drawing board or some computer-aided design regime. These things are actually being produced and tested. A ship designed to operate completely without humans. You've heard of autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. Driverless cars used to be definitely science fiction. Now, they're being deployed. They're being manufactured. And to some extent, more and more of an intent is to have human beings disconnected from the battlefield for safety, and to have the weapon systems be more autonomous or with either remote human control or no human control. The big argument about there, of course, which gets into ethics, is at what point do you give the weapon the kind of authority to shoot without permission? Does it know who to shoot at, when to shoot? When would it be murder as opposed to, understanding in warfare, taking out an opponent who falls within the rules of engagement and the rules of warfare? Helicopters that can function like airplanes. Helicopters have been tested for years to try and do this. The Marine Corps has a weapon called the OV-22 Osprey, which is, if you look at it, looks like an airplane that's got really big propellers on it, but it's what they call a tilt rotor. So when it starts going into the air, the rotors tilt upward, and then it lifts off like a helicopter. But when it gets into the air, then the rotors tilt forward and it looks like an airplane. So this kind of technology has already been explored for a number of years and has proven itself to be viable. Now, some of the services are a lot more interested in pursuing the latest, hottest weapons designs, and they have the resource and the budget to do it. The Marine Corps, at least from my recollection of the Marine Corps, on active duty, we always had the oldest equipment. Much of it was handed down from the Army. The Marine Corps always had, for example, when it came to snipers. On the rifle range, Marine Corps drill instructors told us all the time, 1 round, 1 kill. The full statement would be, the Marine Corps does not have the money to go around buying a bunch of ammunition. So we want you all to be marksmen, sharpshooters, or experts, because it will be a budget savings. And after all, not to get too grisly about it, you don't need a magazine full of bullets to do the job. 1 round between the eyes will do it. That's why Marines place such a high emphasis on their Marines knowing how to shoot. And as I said, that pretty much summed up the attitude on the rifle range. 1 shot, 1 kill. When it comes to our procurement process, where the military gets these weapons, what DARPA is doing, who gives them the green light to proceed on some weapons, who gives them the green light to buy, how we go around actually pursue, I think so many people are unaware of exactly how does a weapon system go from concept to drawing board to testing to deployment in the field. There are all kinds of issues that come into play here, all kinds of variables. And needless to say, many of them involve politics. Now, some people, of course, think that honesty in politics is probably the best joke you can imagine, but there has to be some type of an expectation of what our budgeting system, what our weapons procurement system is doing. I thought I would share with you, whoops. Let me just find my place real quick. I thought I would share with you as we get into this, some of the weapon systems that have been developed over the years that some people might call white elephants or boondoggles, or basically, or if you want to just put it bluntly, waste of money. Let's take a look. For example, $337 million a year was spent on preserving outdated technology. Bear with me as I read. As you can see on the screen here, the latest report by the Government Accountability Office found that more than $337 million per year is needed to operate and maintain the federal government's 10 legacy systems that is outdated, rather than using newer and more efficient technology. Among the outdated tech is a 14-year-old Air Force computer system whose coding language is rarely used anymore. So 337, or to round it up, $340 million to maintain systems that are either barely used or not used at all. In 1987, Yucca Mountain out in Nevada. Now, I personally saw this because I was with the Marine Corps out in Southern California and saw some of this, or had an opportunity to see Yucca Mountain. At the time, Nevada was chosen to be America's principal nuclear waste repository. And I remember it was a big, big deal. The anti-nuclear people were out protesting, the pro-defense people were out protesting. So it was a very, very big deal in Nevada. The site was finally approved in 2002. And one of the things that the anti-nuclear people were protesting were concerns over safety. As you can see here, safety concerns did become a bigger issue. And then later on, after the site had been agreed upon, they started spending money. It was found that nuclear power stations could store their own waste on site safely for decades. But that was only when by 2011, the funding was stopped after $15 billion had already been spent. Something else I found, $74 million for peanuts for loan repayment programs. the Department of Agriculture apparently accepts peanuts instead of money from struggling farmers. To strengthen the local peanut industry, farmers can hand over their crop as repayments for loans from the federal government instead of selling it at market prices. In 2016, the government funded loans that were worth $74 million. Now, this does not have a direct contact or direct application to defense procurement, but this was so ridiculous, this was so good, I couldn't resist putting it in here. As you can see, this is a picture of Afghanistan. We are currently in Afghanistan. We have troops deployed to Afghanistan. We have been in Afghanistan in some form or fashion since September 11th, 2001. Afghanistan, of course, was that place where Osama bin Laden set up shop. Afghanistan was that place where we went to war to get Osama bin Laden. It is a place where the Taliban has been operating for more than a decade. The other part about Afghanistan is you take a look on the left, the people on the left, they're dressed in camouflage uniforms. How does that apply? I'm glad you asked. In 2017, the Pentagon supplied Afghan National Army troops with green patterned uniforms. The problem was this: Afghanistan is 98% desert. So you don't need green woodland uniform camouflage in a desert. The bigger problem was that, of course, when you're wearing green camouflage uniforms in a desert, that means you're going to stick out. So the Afghan soldiers are basically walking billboards for their enemy to say, shoot them. The cost of the uniforms was $28 billion. You know, in putting this together, it made me think about that. Think of this: Afghan soldiers in the desert wearing green woodland camouflage uniforms. That to me sounded about as crazy when you think about the American Revolution, pictures of North America, the North American woodlands, green, lush forests. Having those Afghan soldiers wear those green woodland uniforms in the desert was equivalent to, during the American Revolution, British soldiers wearing red coats in the woods of North America. One has to wonder, I asked myself, who was in charge of their procurement process? Sometimes you just got to say, go figure. Now, maybe it was because King George was a little bit mad. He called him Mad King anyway. But whatever the case, there may have been some legitimacy to King George being mad. This quote from him: "I wish nothing but good, therefore everyone who does not agree with me is a traitor and a scoundrel." I did, however, find, just to give some sense to this, I did find this quote from the New York Historical Society. Please bear with me as I read. "While the vibrant color red is very aesthetically pleasing, it also was a standout color, played an important role in battle as well. Battlefields during the American Revolution were very smoky, but the red cut through the haze, making it easier for the British to identify each other in the midst of chaos. Shooting at their own troops was definitely one of the potential consequences the British were able to avoid. So red was seen as a ferocious color, and it had been proven to increase aggression in soldiers. Over time, however, due to the chemical nature of the vegetable dyes used to British uniforms to turn them red, over several years on the campaign, their uniforms would fade to brown and be less obvious targets." So it turns out that there was a method to the madness for British soldiers using red uniforms. I was not able to find a similar rationale for giving Afghan soldiers green woodland camouflage uniforms in the desert. But getting back to our central discussion. There's something in this investigation, I found something called the Great American Lobster Fest. Toward the end of each fiscal year, federal agencies splurge on outside contractors to run out their budget. Failure to spend means less in the coming year. In 2018, of the $544 billion allotted for outside contractors, almost $97 billion was spent in September, the last month of the fiscal year. the Department of Defense was responsible for almost 2/3 of that last minute expenditure. Now this is DOD, Pentagon DOD. $2.1 million went to games and toys. $490 million went for furniture, and $4.6 million went to crab and lobster tail. Now, personally, I'm from Maryland, and they say Maryland is for crabs, so I wouldn't mind spending a few $1 million for lobster and crab. But really, to the tune of millions of dollars? In 2015, the Department of Defense spent $2 million to hire a team of musicians and researchers to develop robotic music computers. The machines were designed to perform trumpet solos and play alongside human musicians. I have no idea what that was about. And then there's this, something called the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship. Now, if you take all those other expenditures, which were multi-million-dollar and budget overruns and not nearly cost-effective at all, and then consider this, the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship, is a story all its own. Travel with me. The LCS, also known as, the people in the Navy call it the Little Crappy Ship, has suffered from uncontrolled cost overruns, delivery delays, and various mechanical problems, according to Business Insider. The Navy has pumped around $30 billion over roughly 20 years into this project, which was started to create an inexpensive vessel that was small, fast, and capable of handling a variety of missions in coastal waterways. So as you got to the end of the 20th century, at the end of the Cold War, and America had what was once upon called the peace dividend, the mission that the Navy saw for itself was that they needed a fleet of ships that weren't necessarily deep, what they call deep water, blue water Navy, but they needed some ships that will be able to operate closer to the coastal inlands, that were maybe shallower draft, to handle things like drug trafficking, criminal enterprises, or if necessary, to handle more traditional combat operations, and certainly to fight terrorism. The LCS was specifically designed to carry out anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures, and surface warfare missions in contested littoral waters or close inshore waters. But there have been so many problems with the modular mission package designed to be loaded aboard. There are also concerns that the ships were not survivable in high-intensity conflict and that they are not sufficiently armed to perform their missions according to the most Defense Department operational testing and evaluation assessments. It gets better. Take a look and listen at these.
We're getting no sound at all.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes.
can you check, somebody just reported that they were not hearing you. Can you just check your sound?
Sure.
Or do a check? Is everyone hearing him now? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, it looks like whatever the problem was, looks like it has been,
But Susan,
yes.
we are not hearing the sound that accompanies the videos. We're hearing Fred, but not the visuals.
Oh, I
What
see
about-
what you,
What about that one?
We're hearing you, Fred.
Okay. Maybe I'll just skip this video and go on. If it still persists, just let me know with the next one, all right? Let's check this one.
Nope,
Can you hear that, Susan?
nope.
no, I actually
Oh.
can't.
Okay, I don't know what's up. I got the sound turned up over here.
And you're
I'm trying
you're
to-
hearing it, yeah, on your end, correct? Ah.
What?
Christine Pollock said you might need to share computer audio on share screen. Can you go to your share screen and look to see if you're also sharing audio? I cannot do that for you.
I don't see that function. You know what?
So I think I'm having a hard time hearing you now, Dr. Johnson.
I don't see that function.
Okay.
Are you
Christine,
hearing me all right?
I can hear you, and I think everyone can hear you, just not the video.
Okay, we'll just skip it.
I'll
We'll just-
Google
we'll
to
just-
see about embedded videos. I've never seen this before, so I'll look at that while you move on. Okay.
Okay. I'll just skip the videos. That's too bad. I had a really good one too. All right, well, let's get right past it. The Zumwalt is another ship that the Navy's building, which has had a lot of issues with it. I was going to give some background on Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, but given that we're having this issue with the videos, let me just push right on past that. What you can see right here is that by 2008, the Navy was no longer highly concerned with bombarding the military weaker countries, so it contemplated the challenge by China's rapidly expanding surface and submarine fleets. So one problem with the Zumwalt was that its advanced gun system didn't work that well. With the 2/3 forecast, it had a whole lot of fancy things like this, and what they call the LRLAP GPS guided shells, costing $800,000 each. Way more expensive than your regular shells fired by your standard Navy frigate. Now, the Navy was prevented by spending on the Zumwalt because of something called the Nunn-McCurdy Act. As you can see here from nationalinterest.org, despite well-known difficulties of developing next-generation military systems, the Zumwalt was sold to Congress based on unrealistic minimum cost estimates. Eventually, program costs exceeded the budget by 50%, triggering an automatic cancellation according to the Nunn-McCurdy Act. So apparently, in the defense procurement process, when a weapon systems get to a point where it exceeds the originally projected budget estimates, there's an automatic stop or a halt that's brought to further spending until, I guess, further negotiations. Now, the Nunn-McCurdy Act requires the Department of Defense to report to Congress whenever a major defense acquisition program experiences cost overruns that exceed certain thresholds. A program whose cost growth exceeds the statutory thresholds is said to have a Nunn-McCurdy breach. So apparently there is something, I guess there will be more than just Nunn-McCurdy, but there are at least these stopgaps or obstacles, or let's say call them checkpoints, so that when spending gets beyond the pale or was originally expected, it comes to a halt, they can renegotiate some things, and the spending will continue.
Dr. Johnson, Christine has shared a possible fix for the audio problem, but you will have to do it. If you go to the bottom of your screen to share screen, under advanced screen options, there should be an option for you to share your audio. I'm not seeing that because I'm not currently presenting. Do you see that?
No.
Okay. Well, we're gonna have to skip this time. I will look into it.
Okay.
The only other option, if you would like to take 1 minute, if you stop sharing your screen and then re-enter that first window where you get your desktop and the different options, at the bottom of that screen, there will be an option to share your audio. At least when I just Googled it, that's what I came up with. So if you want to stop sharing right now, okay.
Alrighty.
Go back into your share options. And again, I'm not seeing what you're seeing, but hopefully it's what I saw earlier. So go to the share screen.
And here, I'm gonna click share computer sound.
Yes.
Okay.
And that should do it. And thank you so much, Christine. Appreciate it very much.
Oh my God. Okay, that's not gonna do it either, because it's asking for restart your audio sharing application. Yeah, you know what? This is proving too problematic. Let's just move ahead.
Okay.
All right. So by 2008, the Navy sought to ditch building more than 2 Zoom walls in favor of procuring the Arleigh Burke Flight 3 destroyers with ballistic missile capabilities. This is where Senator Susan Collins wrangled a 3rd destroyer. So this is how this works. What I was going to show you all is that this ship and a lot of other defense systems, the way that they have this distributed across the country, there'll be some parts that are built in Maine, other parts that are built in Texas, other parts that are built in California, other parts that are built in Kansas. So what happens is that the defense procurement system is so spread out to where you have significant components that are built in different parts of the country, so that a bunch of politicians all have a stake in making sure that the project continues. Because if it doesn't continue, that means that, let's say for the conning tower or for the bridge or some electronic system, that means that whoever's working on that in the defense plant in their area, in their district, that means those constituents don't have jobs. And of course, if constituents don't have jobs, that has economic consequences, and politicians are held accountable for that. Each Zoom wall now costs $4.5 billion in addition to the $10 billion spent on development. Now there's another one we're going to talk about briefly, the F-35 and the Littoral combat ship. So there's three white elephant projects that have been worked on the last 15, 20 years, the LCS, the Littoral combat ship, the Zoom Walt, and the F-35. The Zoom Walt spiraling costs were due to the Navy's ambition to integrate new technology still being concurrently developed. So here's another thing that happened. The Navy was building the ship while developing the technology for it. I guess the best way of understanding that is, if you've ever heard the phrase flying the airplane while you build it, probably not the best way to go on an airplane flight. No, we want the airplane built, tested, and proved before we get on the airplane. If you go back to earlier this year or late last year and recall the accidents of the Boeing 737 MAX, how they had the onboard software system that caused these aircraft to all of a sudden nosedive into the earth. They did not properly, completely test out the software for the 737. The 737 has proven itself to be a very reliable aerial platform, but it was the software that controlled the avionics, which was the problem. So the Zoom wall was in that same kind of situation. The final design was not stabilized by the time construction began in 2009. The hybrid electrical system has proven challenging to integrate, leading the Zoom wall to break down while crossing, one Zoom wall to break down while crossing through the Panama Canal in 2016. Let's turn our attention to the other weapon system I was talking about, the F-35. The F-35 Lightning has been called the aircraft that none of the major services wanted, but it's too expensive, it's very expensive, and they literally can't afford to not build the thing. As you can see here from this website, it's been called a boondoggle. Sitting on wads of cash or a mountain of money to build it. And there's always this argument, isn't there, that the money we spend on weapons, for example, could have been used to buy every homeless person a mansion with the cost of each one of these. And the interesting thing about this is that the F-35 Lightning has a sister aircraft called the F-22. Now the F-22 has been bought in large numbers as well. That was the aircraft that the military wanted, but the F-35 was basically, in many cases, shoved down the military's throat. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter has been called the most expensive weapons program ever, suffering from technical problems, being years behind schedule, hundreds of billions of dollars, and they suspect that over a 55-year lifespan, the project is going to cost an estimated $1.5 trillion. Now, I'll show this video. You don't necessarily need to have the sound on this to see what weapons design is looking like for the future. Just seeing this will be enough to capture the attention. Oh my God. I trust you all can see why a weapon like that will be problematic in the extreme. Well, that takes us to the warning. The warning I was going to show you all in this video from General Eisenhower, from President Eisenhower, right before he left office, and before President Kennedy's inauguration in 1961. One of the last major speeches that President Eisenhower made was when he warned against the development of something called the military-industrial complex. And basically what he warned against was this. He said that we had to be on watch for, on guard for, very vigilant to make sure that the interests of private military manufacturers did not gain such prominence or such significance in the American economy to where they exercise, I believe the phrase he used was undue influence in the decision-making process of politicians. Politicians are, of course, always interested in the next election getting reelected. And they're interested in reelection based on the needs of their voters, or whether or not what they have to do to get the votes of their voters. And if you take into account everything we said with regard to the Zumwalt, the F-35, the Littoral combat ships, all of those weapon systems, if you think of a map of the United States, the way that they have been farmed out here, some parts there, some parts even overseas. So now this has foreign policy implications. President Eisenhower was warning about the compromise that has to be made at some point, or that could be made at some point, when private economic interests are placed above the interests of the democratic, Republican democratic process in favor of these military manufacturers or armaments manufacturers. Likewise, General Smedley Butler, at the end, this was during the Great Depression. As you can see here, his background indicates, again, the Fighting Quaker, Old Gimlet Eye, Old Duck Board, from 1881 to 1940, 34 years, United States Marine Corps, awarded the Navy Medal of Honor twice, Distinguished Service Medal. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, the most decorated U.S. Marine at the time, realizing that wars are fought for corporate interests, Butler became a critic of U.S. war profiteering. During the Great Depression, he gave speeches in hopes of saving young military men's lives. He ultimately wrote a book, War is a Racket. Some people have highly criticized the book. Other people have taken it as an early sign of what General Eisenhower would be talking about later on. But here's the thing. The reason why General Butler wrote this book was because at the height of the Great Depression, 1932, 1933, 1934, people were hurting so badly economically. And they, of course, they were wondering, just like we did during the Great Recession of a few years ago, people were asking, how did we get in this fix? And in 1934, there was a Senate committee that was established, run by a Nebraska senator named Russell B. Nye. He was what they called back then a progressive Republican. And Gerald P. Nye spent about a year doing investigations as to the causes of the Great Depression. And the one specific thing he was really looking into was the allegations that armaments manufacturers had exercised undue influence on President Woodrow Wilson in 1917, influencing his decision to get into World War I, not because they were so interested in fighting the Kaiser, not because they were so interested in standing up for democracy or promoting democracy around the world, but as an opportunity to get into the war and make money. To make money, those same armaments manufacturers had extended loans to England and France, especially England. And then after the war, those same armaments manufacturers and the banking sector as well had refinanced loans to those governments. And also, when the Germans found out that they could not keep up with the loan payments for operations, there were loans extended to them, to their government that allowed them to pay money to the British and the French, that allowed the British and the French to pay on the loans and the money they owed to these manufacturers into American banks. And that when Hitler came to power in 1932, when it became apparent that they could not keep up with the loan payments, eventually what happened was that it caused a crisis in the economic system, which caused the stock market collapse in 1929. And then eventually in 1933, when Hitler came to power, the Germans decided they weren't going to pay back their loans at all. The French and the British could not service their loans. And the American Depression, which was already bad, got worse. So people on this side of the Atlantic were wondering, how did this all happen? And they all were pointing back at the armaments manufacturers. So looking at all that, General Butler, alive at the time, wrote his book, War's a Racket. And he said, war's a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, surely the most vicious. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. He went on to say a whole lot more about that. But I would say that this certainly wouldn't be the last time we hear about this, because the same charge about war profiteering and why can't we turn swords into plowshares came up during the Korean War. It came up for sure during the Vietnam War. And many people have been asking about this again in the current conflicts that we're in. So not the last stand on this discussion, but definitely for General Eisenhower, definitely for General Smedley Butler, and I would say a warning for the rest of us about the reminder to be constantly vigilant to maintain this Republican democracy and looking for those elements or those parts of our society that are actively seeking to have undue influence in the democratic process. I'll take your questions.
Dr. Johnson, I have a question. Do we even know how much money goes towards the military if you add in covert operations and things like that? I mean, does the American public have any real, yardstick for that?
That's a good question. All I can tell you is that it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I think the United States has got, you see different statistics every now and then, but they'll tell you, like, for example, the United States military, the American national defense budget is larger than sometimes 25, 30 nations combined, of our defense partners. So it is one of the largest, if not the largest in the world.
Dr. Johnson, I have a question for you. What can we do about this? What can we as citizens do about this?
As I was putting this together, I asked that question and looking at the scope of it, I asked myself the same question of what could I as an individual citizen do about this? And beyond becoming more aware and using organizations and citizen lobbying efforts, because we have to actually, just like so many other things, the Congress will change when the people say that we want that kind of change. But it's a very fine balance of looking at how we take these defense dollars, these budget dollars, and there's a thing called hard power, which of course is the military, but then there's soft power, which is diplomacy. And for the last few years, and I'll include just to make sure that we're not getting into any dangerous, controversial territory here, both the Obama administration and the current administration could have done a lot more to develop our diplomatic power, right? The soft power. So you look at things like the Peace Corps, cultural diplomacy, programs like, helping out with AIDS programs overseas in Africa, all those things that can be done to help human beings generally when they provide that kind of relief, they help prevent war. But we are living at a time now, and it's not just in the United States, but you find so many countries, like in the Philippines, that have opted for these hard-line foreign policies that, if anything, in response to them, they cause nations to want to spend more money on arms. So what individual citizens can do about that it's such a large fee beyond the scope of the individual citizen. Honestly, at the end of the day, besides expressing your opinion to your congressman or your senator and doing that, I don't know, frankly.
Are there any people in Congress who are having this concern that you're aware of?
Yes, there are all kind of oversight committees that watch this kind of stuff. The Government Accounting Office is supposed to be a nonpartisan office that looks into these things. And as I mentioned to you all, the Nunn-McCurdy Act, they have legislation that's already there, which is automatically triggered to go into action when you have overspending. So there are rules there. But here's the thing about a rule. A rule or a law is only as good as the enforcement mechanism behind it. And honestly, I tell you, I did have I was torn in putting this together. And I wanted to make sure that I mentioned this to you all, because the job that I had before coming to Hope College was working for a defense contractor, aircraft braking systems. At least 30 to 35% of our business was with the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, the Israeli Defense Forces. And, when a company if a company all of a sudden finds itself minus 30% of its operations, that means that's a significant economic hit. That means people are going to be laid off, people are going to lose jobs. Well, part of me did not want to lose a job, so I was always in favor of those contracts. But at the same time, there was always the question, how much should private companies be involved in producing weapons? And how much should our economy be dependent upon that kind of activity? And after a while, I just found myself getting into these constant discussions of what came first, chicken or the egg. You need these companies to produce the weapons that we need to defend ourselves. But on the other hand, how much influence do they have in our political process? And there's a thing that one of the videos I was going to show you, I can't remember the phrase right now, but there's a certain type of a phrase where they say that companies and politicians have figured out a way to make sure that the current system stays exactly the way it is or is modified very little, because what politician wants to, like General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing, which one of those three in an area wants to leave an area? I remember when Boeing was talking about moving their headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, people in Seattle were all up in arms about that. I think they eventually did, or maybe it was somewhere in Wichita. But either way, the people in Wichita, those politicians don't want those jobs to leave. I know the people in Akron, Ohio didn't want aircraft braking systems to leave. So they have these things spread out so that you have politicians on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, all equally have a stake in this and making sure that the system remains as unchanged as possible, because they don't want that direct impact on their constituents.
Fred, does Citizens United decision play into this?
Yeah, the Citizens United, which was the Supreme Court decision that said corporations have civil rights. Yeah, it gave corporations the same kind of civil protections, I believe, that individual citizens have. Now, obviously, individual citizens, at least none of the ones that I know, have the same kind of economic clout to exercise influence on Capitol Hill. This goes back to the other question that Russ had. Individual citizens don't have the kind of deep pockets to influence people on Capitol Hill with lobbying efforts like that. But the Supreme Court wanted to go ahead and continues to want to go ahead and play this fiction like a corporation is an individual, like you're an individual, I'm an individual. Well, all right, I guess you can look at it like that, but then it becomes more a matter of law than a matter of reality. So I would say, yeah, Citizens United has something to do with that.
Professor Johnson, was General Butler an America First person? He died right before the beginning of the Second World War, and his concerns, I think, and General Eisenhower's are well-founded about the military-industrial complex. But on the one hand, he was, I was just wondering, was he opposed to the United States helping Great Britain and the other allied countries before his death, you know, because that's one war that I think almost everybody agrees we needed to and had to fight.
Right, right. And you know, if you look at the trajectory of what General Butler was saying, you might think that had he lived longer, he might have been an America First person. In other words, let's not waste our resources in another war over there. Let's not get bamboozled one more time about getting involved in the European land war. But the thing that makes me think the other way is that General Butler also, before he died, he discovered a plot, at least it was an alleged plot, that he thought to overthrow the government. And he was very instrumental in bringing that to people's attention.
Okay.
So, you know, Smedley Butler, like we all are, he was a very complex guy. But I think I think that General Butler, if he did get that impression that he would have been an America Firster, I think that the moment Pearl Harbor hit, and even when Hitler attacked, I think that he might have been able to see his way through to understanding that America could not stay out of that conflict. And of course, as you know, by 10 o'clock that morning on December 7th, 1941, anybody who was an America Firster, they were obsolete. Pearl Harbor did away with that whole movement.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor.
Sure.
My parents were pacifists until Pearl Harbor, and then they stopped being pacifists. Probably not the only ones.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor did it for a lot of people. And it's very interesting when you think Americans, that just goes to show the impact of World War I, that it had this lingering impact. World War I changed the world in so many ways. And because that generation, so many people tied the Great Depression to Americans being involved in World War I, they felt bad about what was going. They felt bad about Europe sliding into fascism under Mussolini, what was happening in Germany, but not enough to get involved in the European land war. And so, from a domestic standpoint, you consider what President Franklin Roosevelt was dealing with. On the one hand, this goes to it's pre-Cold War, obviously, and the usual tradition in American military history was that America went to war usually when America was directly threatened. And from 1933 to 1939, although it was troubling, although there were many people concluding that America might eventually get involved in the war, America was not directly threatened. Now, December 7, 1941, America clearly had been threatened. Now there's no choice. The way it's clear, FDR gets involved in the war. FDR declares war on Japan, and Germany declares war on America on December 11th. That is a far cry from what happens in 1947, 2 years after World War I ends, when during the Greek crisis, President Truman issued something called, what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, which says that America will help to resist foreign influence or communist influence that's trying to overthrow democratic governments around the world, and will help militarily, politically, and economically. Now, for the first time, an American president, because of the new environment of the Cold War, is saying, we have an interest involved in getting involved in a conflict where the United States homeland is not directly threatened. This changed the entire nature of what American foreign policy and American military policy had been for the greater part of our history, and continues to be a significant influence, aside from the fact, of course, on 9/11, we, of course, were attacked directly. So that has been part of what's been driving us as well.
Dr. Johnson, a case could be made for preparedness being necessary, certainly, but the amount of money that's spent, the new technology, the interest in having a place to test it out and use all that, do you think that's accounted for why we've virtually been in one conflict after another since World War II? It's almost
You know, I had a professor in college that said nations that have weapons have a propensity to use them. Now, so the more weapons you have, the more the likelihood of using them. But is that really the case? And I agree with you. You know, and I guess I should tell you all, I'm not squeamish on the military. I'm pro-military. I don't mind the use of force to like the Strategic Air Command used to say, peace through strength. There are some nations around the world, they don't get the whole diplomacy thing. They're in strength, and that's how you have to come at them. I'm not saying go to war, but you cannot afford to be weak with them. But at the same time, there are some questionable issues about all this. On active duty, we used to send Marines down to Vieques to use Vieques as a bombing range, and of course, there were people that lived on those islands that didn't like their island being used as a bombing range for the U.S. Navy. There are these other things that, like I said, working aircraft braking systems, where our executives used to go overseas twice a year for the Paris Air Show and the London Air Show. Did they all have to go? What did they do over there? Were they looking at aircraft all the time? I can tell you that they weren't doing that all the time. So there's all kind of expenses that go on. And that's why I always liked the Marine Corps model. They were very efficient with the tools that we had. Now, admittedly, some of the stuff we had to use on active duty in the Marine Corps was old, ancient, obsolete, and very difficult to maintain. But we also cannot afford to be on the back end of those kind of technological developments, such as what I was showing you all with that robotic technology, because that stuff is not coming, it's here. It's here. And the larger question for me is, as we develop these weapon systems, what does it do to our nature and concept of war? Does it make war more or less likely? If war becomes so efficient, if we remove the human being from the battlefield, we want our people to stay alive, and that's a great thing. But if we sanitize war to the point where where it becomes something you can do, you can be in the Nevada desert and kill somebody 11,000 miles away with a drone strike. What does that do psychologically? What does that do to our understanding of war? What does it do to the threat value, the risk assessment? Does it make us more likely to get into war? Does it make us less likely? Can we manage war? Does that make us more arrogant? Does it make us think that we have conquered the threat of violence? And I worry about that. Final point, I worry about that because that belief that people had handled war, conquered conflict, was pretty much a significant mindset right before World War I. They hadn't had a conflict, a European land war, in about 40 years from 1871. So from 1871 to 1914, no major land conflict. They thought they had licked war. And then August 1914 came. They found out that they had absolutely not defeated war or the risk of it.
Dr. Johnson, you do have a question that came through chat from Richard Byrne. And his question, and I don't know if this refers back to an earlier comment, but it is, what does Bill Huizenga think?
I do not know. I don't know. I haven't heard him speak on this particular issue. I can tell you that when I was running for Congress, the issue of defense and conflict and national defense and procurement came up every now and then, but nothing really in depth. So I would not venture to say exactly what our congressman what his policy is on this.
Hello, Fred.
Yes.
Elver Skier here. In the last year or so, the Russians and the Trump administration have each bowed out of a nuclear treaty. And of course, each side is saying we're only doing it because the other side is. But isn't there a pretty strong likelihood that economics is behind the whole idea of another arms race?
Well, given the trajectory of this particular, now if okay, short answer, yes. The weapons manufacturers, of course, would be involved and maybe building and updating, weapon systems. And again, there's the balancing point, right? You have old, I kind of hit on legacy systems. You don't want our nuclear defense forces to be reliant upon technology from the 1960s and the 1970s. So it's got to be brought into the 21st century. That's going to cost money. That's money that has to be spent. But if you're simply exiting from treaties as not so much a foreign policy initiative, but as an economic strategy, okay, there clearly are questions involved in that. And I'm aware of the exit by both of these countries. And I don't know what your reaction was, but I thought, I think that when countries are sitting down talking to each other, instead of going to their separate corners, especially on issues of nuclear weapons, it's a lot better to have them at the table talking instead of going to their respective corners. And if it's being done for economics, it makes it even more reprehensible.
Thanks much. One of my reactions was the president and Mr. Putin have spent time talking without the benefit of the rest of us knowing what they talk about. And I wondered whether that also played into the possibility of motivations behind this.
That's true. And it's anybody's guess what they've been saying. I will give the administration credit for this much. I don't know how effective it's been, but no American president, to my knowledge, has ever been able to sit down with a leader of North Korea. Now, it still is yet time to play out to see just exactly what kind of fruit that's going to yield. But if you truly believe that it's better to be sitting down and talking with people instead of shooting at them or being in their respective corners, okay, the American president, an American leader, has sat down with the leader of North Korea. That is a very, very unusual thing to happen. And if we can build on that in a positive fashion, that's the remaining variable that has yet to be seen.
Fred, it seems to me that over the years, whenever we get into a recession or we're heading into a recession, that the government does two things. It stirs something up, and we get involved in a military conflict, it seems. And the other benefit to that is we take people out of the employment force and put them into the service to help solve the problem. I seem to feel that that's happened in the past.
Yeah, well, many people are of the opinion that it was World War II that finally brought America completely out of the Great Depression. Needless to say, they're ramping up to get ready for World War II. The nation became the arsenal of democracy, and Michigan certainly benefited directly from that. And so people were put to work. You have a significant part of your workforce that goes overseas to fight, which creates a lot of jobs for those who are remaining. And so it's unemployment for all the folk who are back here, and the economy's cranking along at a pretty good clip. The risk of that, of course, is that when conflict starts, then you have a lot of economic adjustment that has to happen in the post-war world called inflation. But I don't know if I could establish right now whether or not that's a commonality or trend line, because certainly a lot of armament expenditure during the Vietnam conflict, but you also have, Vietnam also was occasioned by recessions every now and then. I think if anything, people might say that one thing that happens if we follow your model, Mike, is that you find a lot of people who are out of work, and even during peacetime, people who are going to the military. I know my father was one of these people that went into the military because for him it was a ladder to upward mobility. So for a lot of people, even joining the military today, it's a way of getting GI benefits, maybe going to school, getting 3 hot meals, and getting some job skills training that they wouldn't get otherwise. That's okay as long as there's no conflict. It's just that we've been in a state of constant conflict since 2001.
Professor Johnson, I noticed that you had mentioned that Germany declared war on the United States in 1941, even before we had a chance to declare war on them. Was that a mistake by Hitler in your view? And would have FDR been able to get a war resolution through Congress against Germany, given the fact they had not directly attacked us?
I think the United States, and I know I should not be engaging in historical what if, but just to go ahead along with this, the United States clearly went to war factually with Germany because Hitler declared war on us on December 11th. In hindsight, of course, it was a mistake for Hitler to declare war on us because in June of 1941, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. By December of 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was not, in fact, it was going very well. The Germans were victorious in so many different areas. So from that standpoint, it made sense for Hitler to not be worried about what might happen in the future. What eventually would have happened, I think, was that because the United States was so closely tied to Great Britain through Lend-Lease by that point, and because Winston Churchill had been cultivating that relationship with FDR, that, and again, we can't say for sure, but I think it's very likely that given America's connection to Great Britain and the fact that Great Britain was at war with Nazi Germany, that the United States probably would have ended up on the side of the British anyway, which would have put us at war with Germany. As it was, Hitler saved everybody the trouble.
Yep, thank you.
And who could possibly have seen well, Hitler's general staff probably saw it as events kept on evolving, but the defeat of Stalingrad in February 1943 completely upended the German. That was the beginning of the end of Hitler's offensive movements in Russia. From that point forward, it was a defensive war. They weren't done. They were not defeated, but they definitely were not on the offensive anymore.
Professor,
While we have a break, yes.
I have a comment about the warning for us to beware of military-industrial complex. The thing that's so hard about doing something about that is in the name of that comment that says complex, because every organization that is part of the military industrial complex is involved with so many other things that you can't isolate it to just one thing.
That's right.
How do you do it? There's no way. It's an impossibility.
I really wish I could remember that phrase that was in the video. That's why I wanted to show you all that video. Maybe I'll send it to Susan and she can send it out to you all. But there's a phrase to get to your question where the defense procurement system has been either by design or by accident, and I think more by design, it's been designed so that if everybody in on this call, this meeting, were a politician, the defense procurement system has been so designed to where each one of us would have a stake in making sure that it stays exactly where it is, and it stays exactly the way it is. Because if any one part of it goes away, our constituents would be hurt economically. They'd be out of jobs. Well, people, when they don't have jobs, tend to be in a bad mood and want to vote for someone that can bring them those jobs. So you take that aspect and then add to it that the military-industrial complex, such as it is, now includes things like the private defense contractors who are providing security services, who in some cases are providing food services, mail services. I mean, these are all things that the military used to do by itself, but these things have been farmed out. So, you know, even the very nature of what we're doing and what combat means anymore has changed. And some of the questions that come along with that are not only the economic impact, but for example, like what happened in Iraq, I think, a number of years ago. You have civilian contractors, they end up killing civilian Iraqis. Are they subject to the Universal Code of Military Justice? Are they subject to Iraqi justice? Are they subject to the justice of the International Criminal Court? American justice? I mean, is it a civil case? military case, international case, how do you adjudicate all that? And if in fact you don't hold them accountable, what does that do for your foreign diplomatic relations with the fledgling Iraqi government? All these things that begin to impact, and I don't think that, at least not to my knowledge, they have not clearly shaken this stuff out. You know, and I remember being at the International Tribunal in Arusha, Tanzania back in 2004. 2004 was the 10th year the International Criminal Court had given, the ICC had been given 10 years to resolve the issues of finding the perpetrators of the Rwanda genocide of 1994. And that court, although international, it has some teeth. People who were perpetrators or alleged perpetrators of the Rwanda genocide, they were tried in that court and they were sent to jail. And I remember sitting there thinking as I watched that, how would this apply to American citizens? Because I know that no American president, at least none that I know of, would allow an American military person to be tried in that court and be sent to a jail internationally. Now, when you further complicate that with the variable of foreign contractors or independent contractors, how does that even work? How do you classify that?
Dr. Johnson, I was able to find Eisenhower's speech on the military-industrial complex, and if you unshare your screen, which I know it's not shared currently, but I'm not seeing an option to share mine. It's about 3 minutes and 17 seconds long, the link
Okay.
that I have. Would you like me to play that in our remaining time, or would you like to take questions?
No, go ahead and play it.
That would be good.
Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, let's see what I can do.
I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
This speech did not get very much attention. When a new president is coming to power, as John Kennedy was, the spotlight was not on Dwight Eisenhower.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
There was a feeling at the time that this must have been written by some speechwriter who just sneaked into the speech.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 months ago, we got contacted by a family up in Minnesota saying that we have documents from Malcolm Moose. He was responsible in part for drafting the military-industrial complex speech.
These new papers give us written evidence that this was not just some caprice of Eisenhower's or something by some speechwriter.
You see the evolution of his speech from May 1959 to 1961.
And he wanted to give this speech for a long time, 2 years.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea.
There was one person in Dwight Eisenhower's life whom he really confided almost everything to, and that was his brother Milton.
There's one particular document where the speechwriters had already drafted their version of the speech, only to see Milton come along and totally revamp what had already been written.
When Milton Eisenhower was taking notes and writing things on the drafts of these speeches, the speechwriters knew that it wasn't Milton talking, it was Ike.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
He would see magazines with advertisements for some, new warplane or some bomb, and he got so angry he'd take the magazine and throw it into the fireplace of the Oval Office because he felt that defense spending should not be something that would be encouraged by companies who are seeking commercial gain.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
There is an interesting document. It shows that the farewell speech will be made to Congress. But yet, President Eisenhower decided, no, he was going to address the people.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
One test.
You all will notice General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, said several things there. He said that he used the phrase, the gathering of undue influence. He said whether that undue influence was intentional or inadvertent. He said something about, that we have to be properly aware. That means the citizenry, it's the same thing Thomas Jefferson talked about with regard to the hope for Republican democracy, that people would, of their own initiative, take the time to be aware of what's happening in the government. And for one question, he talked about the unmeshing, the intertwining of. So there's several things happening here that General President Eisenhower is talking about that speak to a military industrial complex that is thoroughly enmeshed together, that if we're not very aware, if we're not vigilant, we're going to miss. It can be intentional or unintentional, meaning there'll be some people that want it to happen, and other people, well, they won't miss it. They won't mean for it to happen, but it will just accrue on its own. And that it is something that could possibly destabilize. He said that this undue influence, and then he tied it at the back end to a threat to individual liberties. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, a man who was born in the early part of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and now it's the middle of the 20th century, it's 60 years later, that this man who's devoted his life to the profession of arms and has been a president in the Cold War, I think the suggestion would be we take his advice.
Thank you. We have about a minute left of the video. It is 11 o'clock, and I just wanted to allow for a little bit more time to finish this video if you would like, and to take more questions. And if you need
I'll take more. We've got the better part of the video. That's the main part.
Okay.
Let's defer to questions.
Fred?
Yes.
Would you like, this is Peg Van Grau, would you like to comment on how much what you have said, what you have taught us in your wisdom, your ethical background, and your history knowledge of today? Where are we today in terms of an aware citizenry, of a community of people that would be willing to make the effort and really work out some of the issues that we're fighting today?
We need to do I'll speak as an historian, we need to do a much, much, much better job of teaching and learning our history.
Or we're doomed to repeat it.
Well, history has echoes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you, let me do maybe a slight lateral movement here. I taught for the class I taught for the seminary this past June. It was a class called The History of the Black Church. And I told the students that before we can understand, before I can tell them about the Black preaching, call and response, Black gospel music, Black liturgy, anything in the Black church, I told them we first have to deal with this fact. My understanding of God's vision for the church is that there should be no such thing called the Black church. Mm-hmm. There's not supposed to be a Black church. It's like there's not supposed to be a Latino church, an Albanian church, a Serbian church. It's supposed to be the church. And yet there is the church. So until we answer the question, why did there have to be a Black church in America? We got to go back to the source of what made it, what was the reason where Black Christians and white Christians found that they could not worship together, and why did Black Christians feel compelled to break off and go establish their own church? To deal with that, you're going to go back to the antebellum period and the slave system and the fact that it was a race-based slavery. So many students in that class did not understand the basics. They said they'd never even heard of it, or that they had not been taught the information that I gave to them over that 4, 5, 6 week period. And so I can't tell you how many emails I got from people saying, I've never heard of this before. And they said, how can I be in grad school and not have heard of this? I said, I don't know how you can be in grad school and not have heard of it. That's what we're talking about it right now. So people can't know what they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So so if we take that example of not knowing about that and all that goes on relative to the social implications of that, and use that with regard to our defense history, our national history, our procurement policies, and everything else. Thomas Jefferson, for whatever his other flaws may have been, he was spot on when he had the vision. And one of the reasons he established the University of Virginia is that people in a Republican democracy, they have to be involved. They just can't assume that somebody else will do the job and that'll all be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Benjamin Franklin, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, was asked by a woman, what kind of government do we have? A monarchy or a republic? He said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not guaranteed. We have got to be aware. We've got to know. I heard Joyce Meyer say, you live life forward, understand it backwards. All right? So we don't get hung up by the past, but we understand what happened back then so we can do better as we're living life forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say real quick, I have so missed you guys. I have missed you, missed you.
We missed you.
Dr. Johnson?
Yes.
It's Kit. Hi. We've
Kit.
missed you too. And I wanted to make a brazen promotion here for your course being offered this fall. We assume it's going to be on Zoom, but the new course that Dr. Johnson is going to be teaching this fall is The Long Reach and Cataclysm of World War I. And I know that you mentioned that there's a lot of new information that you've been uncovering about this tumultuous time. And so I'm hoping that people remember and look forward to signing up for that class with you.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Okay. Well, that was a wonderful class. Thank you very much. If you'd like to stay on, Dr. Johnson's agreed to answer a couple additional questions. If you'd like to log off, this would be a good time to do so. And we just look forward to seeing you at another class. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Fred,
you.
do you have any idea how far your words, how far your influence reaches through your students, through your lectures, through us, perhaps, through a national level? Are you being heard, for example, in Congress?
I don't know if I'm being heard in Congress, but I'll tell you this much, Peg. After George Floyd was killed, the students who were in my slavery and race class this past spring, they communicated, they shared with me that because they had been through that class, and we had some hard conversations in that class.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, when I say hard conversations, I get that a lot of students, look, I mean, it's no surprise to you guys that, you know, in a class like that, most of my classes, the students, I mean, the class population is predominantly white. And so they're very, very reluctant to talk about these issues because, you know, or maybe past experiences or fears of, you know, somebody, you know, nobody wants to seem like they're ignorant or be called racist. It takes me at least half the semester to get them to understand and feel confident enough that there'll be no verbal decapitations. I tell them that I need for my white students to park their guilt out the door, my students of color to park their anger outside the door, because guilt and anger gets in the way of me doing my job. It's hard enough just getting the information of history. Never mind having to work through the filter, the sludge of guilt and the sludge of anger. But once we finally started talking about this stuff, we really got down to the nitty gritty of it all. And then the semester ended. Then the thing with George Floyd happened. One student after another started emailing me saying, because we had talked about this, because we had gone over the history, they didn't understand everything, but they had a better understanding of it. So there were 20 of them in that class. I'm hoping that they'll take what I share with them and share with other people. There were 18 people in that Black church history class. I'm hoping that they take what I share with them and share with other people. But I don't think, I'm not so sure how much clout my voice has in Congress, I think that the cosmos has dictated that I'm supposed to be here talking to you all instead of being in Washington. And
What
frankly,
about
I
the
think it's a
great,
lot more- I think I find it to be a lot more fun talking to you guys than folk back there anyway.
what about the great courses? Are you familiar with that series of very fine professors on subjects across the spectrum? I don't know anything at all about how that is brought to bear, who goes out and recruits, but can we nominate you?
Sure. I'll record some.
I'd love to follow up on the possibility that your voice could be heard in many other settings, much like HASP.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering, when you talk about the class you ran at Hope, is there some benefit or opportunity to run something similar in our community?
Sure. Sure. I mean, look, people can't know what they don't know.
Right.
And it's so many Americans, you know, and I get it. I get it. You hear people, you know, in the street talking about we're tired of X, Y, Z happening. And people that have no knowledge are thinking, well, when has X, Y, or Z been happening? Well, for one community, it's been happening for a long time and been reconstituting itself and showing up in old wine and new bottles. But we can't know what to look for unless we know what it is we're looking for. I usually use this example. If you recall the Senate Judiciary hearings with Clarence Thomas back in the 1990s, I had a boss at the aircraft company who watched that, and he had a chill go down his spine because he was the biggest sexual harassers in the company. Turned out he was a VP of operations. He came to me, the guy in charge of training, and said, I want you to develop a class on the hazards of sexual harassment. Well, I was working in the HR Human Resources Department, and just to give a number, there are like maybe 8 or 9 people in there. And of the 9 folk we had in the department, 4 were, 3 were men, 5, 6 were women. Now I consider these women that I worked with them for 13 years. They were my sisters, they were my friends. We did, company picnics together. They were like, in many ways, part of my family. But when I started going around, I had never heard of sexual harassment before. But when I started going around asking basic questions, has this ever happened to you? Is this true that this happened? When these women started telling me about what they were going through every day on the job, not some days, every day on the job, I could not believe what I was hearing. And then they started showing me. Now, once I saw what sexual harassment was, then I couldn't unsee it. But until then, as a guy in the workplace, I had no reason to be looking for sexual harassment. It didn't happen to me. I didn't do it. So therefore, I was on the lookout for it. But when these women started educating me on what sexual harassment was, then I said, okay, we have a problem in here. It was a big problem. So to get to your question, if you take that example and transfer it to what we're talking about, yeah, if people don't know what to look for, maybe we can help their eyes get open and have scales fall from their eyes. Then they'll at least be aware of what people are talking about.
Yep.
More questions? Comments? Observations?
It's like a fabulous feast of information, challenge that we have to digest for a while. But thank you.
Fred?
Hi, Ron.
Yeah, how you doing? Hey, I was just so people understand the money aspect of the military, your 2019 physical budget was 610 for the military and about 610 billion, and it's about 70 billion for the wars. And the next year, which starts in September, it'll be 986 billion.
Yeah.
FYI.
So that's close to $1 trillion. And so, I mean, I know a number of people in HASP have worked for the federal government. So forgive me if I'm saying something you already know, but the way that the fiscal year runs in the federal government is, at the start of a fiscal year, they give you a certain budget, and that's based on what your needs were from last year, what your projected needs are for this year. Now, if you get as the fiscal year ends, if you get to that point where you have money left over in your budget and you don't spend it, what that means is that for the coming budget year, you won't get as much. So what everybody in the federal government does, generally speaking, is they try to spend down that money to get it to clear the budget out, to zero it out. So when they go for their next budget ask, they can get as much or more. Nobody wants to get less. So there's always the possibility of it going up and up and up and up. It's a crazy system and not designed to be cost effective.
Fred, what were the repercussions of your cancellation of your trip to Vietnam?
A number of students, and this happened with the Vietnam trip and also a lot of our overseas programs, we had students who signed up for those classes. Of course, they're expecting to get maybe 4 credit hours for being overseas. They're going to do a project, but when they couldn't go overseas, all of a sudden, and our students are generally very organized. They're on a tight schedule of knowing what they have to take per semester. When they couldn't get that class in May, that messed up their scheduling for the fall. So what the registrar's office did was they started offering a bunch of classes for the May term. And I ended up teaching something called a senior seminar, where we had a group of seniors who were going to go do something else, but they decided to take a class called, that I think I've done this class with you all, Acts of Love in Time of War. So I taught them that class over the course of like 4 weeks, and they're finishing up their papers for me now. So that's how it impacted me.
Thank you.
I of course missed going to Vietnam. Vietnam is just, I'm hoping I can get back there at least by December.